Good. Afternoon, everybody. Afternoon. Hi. So just wanted to welcome you all to this chat and introduce Robin. Most of you may have seen Robin about, either previously as a staff member, but more recently she's been stalking us. So yeah, a fascinating piece of research that Robin's been doing using WaterAid as a case study on the concept of moral legitimacy, which she will explain to you. I'm not even going to attempt to do that. And yeah, I think it really tells an interesting story about the journey that WaterAid's been through over the last few strategies, and potentially where it may be helpful informing us in terms of our future directions on how we claim our moral legitimacy in the world, in the aid skeptic world, perhaps. So yeah, I'll hand straight over to Robin without any further ado.
Thanks, Eric. All right, so this is my first time presenting on my research findings, so I'm very excited as well as slightly nervous, because most PhDs feel like this. All right, so we are living during a very interesting time. Never before has trust in some of society's foundational institutions been so low, and public opinions so polarizing. And this isn't just me saying this, this is backed up with strong evidence and experiences that we're seeing all over the world today. So what exactly is happening? Sociologists and theorists would argue that we are experiencing a global crisis of legitimacy. So within organizational theory, which is where my research firmly sits, legitimacy is defined as a generalized perception or assumption that the actions of an entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate within some socially constructed system of norms, values, beliefs, and definitions. And there are apparently three main types of legitimacy that can explain how people grant legitimacy to traditional institutions. There's pragmatic, corporates primarily possess this. Cognitive, government primarily possesses this, and moral, NGOs primarily possess moral legitimacy. And if you want to try and understand these in a different light, we can rely on the conception of value that is typically talked about in businesses. So pragmatic moral legitimacy aligns really well with demands for tangible value from the public, whereas cognitive aligns really well for demands on intangible value, and moral legitimacy aligns really well for demands on aspirational value. And so my research specifically looked at this concept of moral legitimacy. Why? Because I'm looking at a development NGO, and NGOs primarily rely on this type of legitimacy, and also because this is the type of legitimacy that people are demanding very, very strongly right now. It's a demand for moral legitimacy, a demand for aspirational value. And ultimately, if we look back at what's going on in the world right now, this is happening maybe because of these polarizing opinions and essentially a battle over social norms grounded in our fundamental beliefs and values that we're currently witnessing across the globe. All right, so why does moral legitimacy matter to NGOs? Well, NGOs have historically enjoyed strong moral legitimacy, and this has been a source for eliciting trust, speaking with authority, and securing both staff and donor support. And I put Amnesty's logo of the candle up here because I think it's really symbolic of the general public perception of NGOs, whereas we have historically at least been seen as the keepers of the moral flame. And because NGOs uniquely primarily rely on moral legitimacy, the morality side of it really makes it easy to trust, grant authority, and to secure staff and donor support. And let's just take a look at that a little bit in the context of WaterAid. So I interviewed over about 60 staff during this research project, and I asked why people worked for the third sector, and everyone gave me a morally motivated response, most of the time consciously aware that they were making a salary sacrifice to work for an organization that aligned with their values. So this is just an example quote from one of my participants. And obviously the pay isn't as great as, say, a corporate sector, but I wanted to do something that was around helping rather than making money. Also, I thought it was really interesting, during a lunchtime talk I attended, executive of Soap or Doper really captured this well in terms of why corporates have historically, and still do, tend to partner with NGOs. It's so that they can kind of borrow a degree of our inherent moral legitimacy. So during the lunchtime talk, he said, it looks like in our society, there are much more people caring today than there was 10 to 15 years ago. So yes, it is really important that we partner with the people that care, the people like you at WaterAid. So the moral nature of legitimacy that NGOs tend to draw on really bolsters our ability to do these things. However, there is a current threat to NGOs' moral legitimacy. This is data from 2018 Edelman Trust Barometer that's showing that just between 2017 and 2018, trust in NGOs declined in 14 out of 28 markets. So all of the markets in green, NGOs are distrusted now. And also, very interestingly, if you look at data that was coming out of this report from 2012, NGOs enjoyed significantly higher degrees of trust than all other types of institutions, such as government, corporates, and media. But what we're seeing today is we don't enjoy any more trust than corporates. So I think this really calls into question what our future relevance is and how do we maintain and differentiate ourselves when we're being perceived as equal in moral status to corporates and others today. And corporates are catching on to this too. They're starting to really try and rely on aspirational value and try and build their own moral legitimacies rather than just partnering with others that possess that. So recognizing this global crisis of legitimacy and how it relates to NGOs, my research is specifically looking at trying to develop an understanding of moral legitimacy in practice. So I did this through a case study of WaterAid. And my theory is that if we can understand moral legitimacy in practice, we can mitigate current risks and safeguard our moral legitimacy going forward. All right, so before I dive into my research findings, I just need to walk you through a little bit of theory. So in academia and research, we use theoretical frameworks to help us understand our data. And so I obviously rely on the theory of moral legitimacy. So this exists within organizational theory literature. And essentially what this is saying is that there's 4 subtypes of moral legitimacy that people kind of make evaluations of in order to formulate an opinion of how much moral legitimacy they want to grant. So the 4 different types, there's structural, which is based on evaluations of the structural characteristic of the NGO. So is the NGO, does it look like a typical NGO? Is it in the 3rd sector? Does it rely on volunteers, etc.? Then there's procedural, which relies on evaluations of means. So exactly how are we going about delivering our development projects? Personal, which is relies on evaluations of leaders and representatives. And finally, consequential, which relies on evaluations of ends or the results associated with our development work. And while this side shows how perceptions are formed, NGOs and other organizations can also make claims that align with those types as well. And that's, yeah, okay. Okay, so my research, I essentially have 3 different categories of findings. So I'm going to walk you through all 3 right now. But the first thing I needed to do, because it's never been done before, is test whether or not this theory of moral legitimacy even made sense for trying to analyze NGOs in the first place. So how I did this was I applied the typology of moral legitimacy to try and understand if it could explain changes over time and how WaterAid communicated about itself and its work. And I did this by doing a content analysis of all of our existing global strategy documents, as well as a more in-depth discourse analysis of WaterAid newsletters that aligned with those strategy cycles. And in order to do this discourse analysis, I really had to beef out that theoretical framework I showed you and develop a coding book so that I could code my data consistently. So I think these findings particularly offer significant contributions to the academic literature. All right, so what did I find? Looking at the strategy documents, there were clear shifts in the type of moral legitimacy that WaterAid relied on over time. So back in 1985, our first strategy document, the ethos, drew really heavily on structural moral legitimacy. Then we shifted in 1996 and 2000. Our documents relied very heavily on procedural moral legitimacy. 2005, 2009, consequential moral legitimacy was dominant. And finally, in the most recent global strategy, procedural moral legitimacy is most dominant. And so good researchers always triangulate their findings. So I also did the exact same thing with the newsletters, remember. So this graph shows you the number of claims made by type of moral legitimacy across WaterAid newsletters. They used to be called WaterAid newsletters, now they're called the Oasis. So this is the Oasis that I analyzed. And really fascinating, in 1982, significant reliance on personal moral legitimacy, and this is probably because we were born from the UK water industry and relied on those skills and expertise to bolster our legitimacy initially. Then again, we moved towards significant reliance on procedural, to consequential, to finally procedural again. So what, I guess? Looking at these changes over time for WaterAid, this actually mirrors really well and can be explained by legitimacy theory and the wider development literature. So looking at legitimacy theory, during the initial phases, WaterAid was creating legitimacy. When we moved to procedural, we were maintaining legitimacy that we had created. Then we moved on to try and gain more legitimacy. So relying on consequential moral legitimacy can give a spike can like bolster legitimacy. And then finally, where we're going now is through a period of repairing moral legitimacy. And this isn't WaterAid specific. It's a reflection of the external environment and the wider development sector. So the literature in the wider development sector also aligns. Back in the 1980s, that body of literature could be seen as like the magic bullet theory. We thought that because NGOs were in the third sector, we were particularly well placed to reach the most in need and marginalized, and that granted us strong legitimacy. Then we went through a period of professionalization, then we've gone through a period of corporatization of the sector, and now we're living through this moment of significant skepticism. All right. So the next big area that I wanted to explore was inherent tension that exists between procedural moral legitimacy and consequential moral legitimacy. So this is well theorized in the literature. These tensions are usually always there. And what I found in my experience at WaterAid is that in WaterAid's most recent history, so before we made this shift towards procedural moral legitimacy, there was significant tension between the two in practice. And so I wanted to understand what conditions contributed to tension. And actually, in WaterAid's case, consequential moral legitimacy was dominating over procedural moral legitimacy in practice. So why did that happen? And what were the associated implications? And the theory here is that if we can understand this, then we can try to work towards balancing all the different subtypes of moral legitimacy moving forward to avoid potential risks in the future. And method of analysis for this was relying on my qualitative interviews mainly, and I conducted 59 of those. 25 of my participants were from an IPT PCD group, and 34 were from comms fundraising for the people team. And I tested what I found in my interviews against an in-depth case study of WaterAid and our corporate partners. And the reason I chose this case study is because when I was asking people about what moral dilemmas typically presented in practice, a number of people raised issues around who we take money from, who NGOs more broadly take money from, etc. So this came out strongly in my interview findings. And it also is a really good case example of where these types of tensions will inherently present. All right. So findings then. These were some of the conditions that I found that contributed to consequential moral legitimacy dominating over procedural moral legitimacy in practice. I'm just going to talk you through a couple of them. So if we think about procedural moral legitimacy versus consequential moral legitimacy tends to be more objective and easily measured. whereas procedural moral legitimacy is more subjective and harder to measure. So the ease of measurability associated with consequential moral legitimacy can result in it being dominated in practice. And that is kind of coupled with, if there isn't strong internal guidance or a coherent understanding of what procedural moral legitimacy looks like across the organization, then there's even more subjectivity and it's harder to put into practice. Another one were internal incentives favoring consequential moral legitimacy in practice. So again, this is a historical look. A lot of things have changed since then, but for a while we were just using our global indicators were consequential, quantitative in nature. They were focused on reach, and our KPIs associated with fundraising were focused on income. And this is definitely changing now. I'll get to that soon. But when the internal incentives favor consequential moral legitimacy over procedural moral legitimacy in practice, then it's likely to dominate. Okay, before we move on, does anyone have any questions on this slide and conditions that contributed to consequential moral legitimacy dominating? Or comments, generally. Questions or comments?
Sorry, I was still struggling with the two terms, just to really get a feel for what what the real. I remember you just sort of say a little bit about qualitative, what are the differences between consequential and procedural.
Okay.
Just some practical examples.
Maybe we can go back to this slide. Okay, no problem. Okay, so consequential moral legitimacy is all about the ends, all about results. So, for example, if I was analyzing our newsletters, a claim to consequential moral legitimacy would be identifying quantifiable ends for the purpose of claiming legitimacy. So, over the next 5 years, we aim to reach 25 million people through our direct work. Or over the next 5 years, or in this global strategy cycle, we reach these number of people with our services, we installed these number of taps, toilets, etc. Those sorts of things are consequentialist in nature. Whereas a procedural claim is when you're identifying how aid is delivered for the purpose of claiming legitimacy. So an example here would be in OASIS 2002, early on we decided that it was better to work through local partners rather than ourselves to be the implementers. Or in our work, we put a strong emphasis on sector strengthening, which is a new, something we're doing significantly now, or influencing, or ensuring sustainability of our services by having community ownership in what we're doing, and those sorts of things. Does that make sense? Okay.
So is there any hierarchy or should any organisation at least inherently should be better if it's more procedural or if it's consequential?
Yeah, I did mean to say that in this slide, actually. So the idea is, in order to safeguard moral legitimacy, is to keep a good balance between them all. Keep a good balance between them all. However, that being said, as we saw here, there might be times where it's strategically advantageous to prioritize one over the other. So say you've lost some legitimacy for some reason, a really quick fix to regaining legitimacy is relying on consequential ends. Or to create legitimacy off the bat, a quick fix is to conform to the structural characteristics of any other NGO, and use your personal leaders as the holders of legitimacy to start. So the idea is to keep a good balance once you've established moral legitimacy. At times, you might want to prioritize one over the other for a strategic purpose, but if one significantly dominates over the other in practice, you can see a risk to your moral legitimacy. So what happened here, I guess, in these situations, and the next slide will show, is consequential moral legitimacy was dominating at WaterAid, and that did present some risks to our overall moral legitimacy. But the idea is keep them balanced. Okay.
In the governance.
Yeah, go for it.
Could you explain what's in the governance structures piece in that slide?
Yeah, so I guess this is about how decisions are made. And I know that this actually came up in our global engagement survey as well. People, WaterAid staff, are wanting to understand how leadership are making decisions. So that's the how piece. And so I guess it's about thinking about how are decisions being made? What are the structures? Is it just one individual, or is it a consultative process? And how consultative is it truly in nature? And also, the people that are making decisions, what are their potential other motivators? Keeping those sorts of things in mind. Yeah. Again, a good example of this at WaterAid would be, historically, WaterAid, the CEO of WaterAid UK was also the CEO of WaterAid International. Now we've split those two functions apart because we recognize, from a governance point of view, it probably makes good sense to have those as two independent roles. Those sorts of things. Okay, so these were the conditions that contributed to consequential moral legitimacy dominating in practice at WaterAid. And there were some context-specific implications. The first one I want to draw attention to is staff identity and retention. So because a lot of us work for NGOs for a morally motivated reason, because we want to align our careers with our values, if we don't perceive that that's happening anymore, then that can question our own sense of identity and desire to work for that organization again. So this is just one quote from an interview participant that said, "I have been in the sector for over a decade now, and within a decade I have seen that change. It was more about human values, more about people, about this, and the sector per se has changed to the extent that it's all about fulfilling the targets. These are the number of people that we need to reach, etc. It is making me question, do I belong?" Staff right now are prioritizing procedural moral legitimacy. So they need to see that in practice in order to feel like their values are aligned with the organization. And when this sort of thing happens, it can impact on perceptions of leadership, perceptions of the NGO, and on internal working relationships. So this was quite context specific, but again, I think this is applicable to the wider NGO sector. It's not like specifically WaterAid. And also, another question I asked while I was interviewing staff was, why do you work at WaterAid? What keeps you at WaterAid? And a lot of the responses there were, everyone loves WaterAid. Like, it's a great, great place to work. We've even, we got the 2008 Workplace Survey Award there. So just keep in mind that this is very context specific, looking at these tensions in practice, not at WaterAid as a whole, okay? All right. The final story to tell is that WaterAid has been going through a shift towards procedural moral legitimacy. And I think this is a really exciting story. So what I wanted to understand here was how and why has WaterAid made this shift from consequential moral legitimacy to procedural moral legitimacy in practice. And in order to do this, I analyzed a lot of the change processes that were underway at WaterAid during data collection, and there were a ton. And I relied quite heavily then on key informant interviews and document review and my ethnographic observations. All right, so WaterAid shift towards procedural moral legitimacy in practice. The catalyst for change has ultimately been these emerging demands for procedural moral legitimacy, both internally and externally. So internally, staff prioritize procedural moral legitimacy right now. So that's put some organic pressure on WaterAid. And also, WaterAid's enjoyed a ton of growth over the last 10 years. And when you see growth like that, you need to come back to the procedural side of things in order to ensure coherency across the Federation. So there was internal demands for procedural moral legitimacy. There was also external demands for procedural moral legitimacy, and I think this is really interesting to see through all of the insight team work that has been done. So the audience segmentation work they've done, the engagement framework that we've done. Essentially, we are targeting new audiences that prioritize procedural moral legitimacy, whereas our traditional audiences definitely were prioritizing consequential moral legitimacy. So there's been a shift in external demand. So that has ultimately resulted in the commitment to change, which was seen in the 2015 global strategy that really kind of, I guess, symbolizes this commitment to procedural moral legitimacy in practice. I know we all kind of talk about this shift, and sometimes it's described as a shift away from the traditional charity model towards the change agent charity model, but I'm looking at it through the lens of a shift from one type of moral legitimacy to another type of moral legitimacy. And I went through and I looked at all of the various changes that were going on in WaterAid, for the brand refresh, the accountability framework, PMER, the audience segmentation work. All of it stemmed from the 2015 global strategy, giving them the mandate to go in that direction. So then, how is WaterAid actually implementing that commitment in practice? Essentially, we've been creating an enabling environment. And again, I'm not going to talk you through all of these, but I'll talk through a couple. So a few things that WaterAid's done is redefine value and success to include aspects of procedural moral legitimacy. So value. We used to just value our supporters in terms of income. Now we're specifically valuing them as advocates for the cause as well. If we look at our project delivery work as well, we used to put value on target numbers and reach. Now we're putting significant value on influencing, sector strengthening, all those means pieces. So we've got the value redefined, and we're currently still working through what the measures of success will look like to ensure that that actually happens in practice. So So one way, redefine value and success to include procedural moral legitimacy. Another one, just to kind of bring up, would be then reflecting procedural moral legitimacy across our operational and accountability mechanisms. So a couple of really good examples of this would be the accountability framework itself. It draws on the 9 commitments are very procedural in nature. Also the quality program standards. I know we had these standards before, but historically they existed kind of buried in all their independent frameworks and guidelines. And for the first time ever, we've elevated those and presented those as one consolidated piece of work that can be clearly communicated across the organization. And I think a really interesting piece about this reflect across operational accountability mechanisms has been our efforts to consolidate knowledge and limit the cognitive overhead, or how much thinking time or it takes to actually put procedural moral legitimacy into practice. So it used to be the brand guidelines were quite thin. Now we've got brand guidelines that speak clearly to messaging, personality, tone, etc. Any questions on any of the other ones? So lots of work's been going on around managing talent differently. A ton of new efficiencies and processes and procedures like PMER and supportive systems and softwares, even our intranet.
You just say a bit more about the managing talent. So what does that mean to manage talent and effective procedure?
Yeah, so some of my key informants worked with the people's team, and WaterAid's been going, kind of re-looking at what are leadership skills, what leadership skills do we want to have, and how do we want our leaders to be engaging with others. So that's one big piece of work. And then also the acquisition of talent. So before the strategy, well, we've kind of evolved a lot to be putting a lot of renewed focus on managing talent and trying to bring in the skills and talent that will allow us to deliver the strategy. So bringing in people that have those sector strengthening skills, that have hygiene and behavior change skills. So moving away from like the traditional engineering type technical experts to bring in skills that reflect procedural moral legitimacy. And a ton of that work is going on within WaterAid right now. Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about the last point, the organizational culture?
Yeah, of course. So, okay. So I guess here, what I noticed is, well, culture is obviously a very important thing to WaterAid. It was a very strong priority for Barbara, and specifically cultivating what is called a values-based culture. So there's been strong emphasis from the leadership team on fostering a values-based culture. So just in the last few years, for example, my WaterAid week has been aligned with our values. That's something new. Also, the accountability framework document itself refers to the fact that accountability isn't just this operational thing you do, it's about fostering a culture of accountability. So, yeah, a strong emphasis from the leadership team on trying to create a culture that's very values-based. Yeah.
It looked like when you presented who you spoke to, it was predominantly people here in the UK office, and obviously your observation days were being based here in the UK office. So I was wondering if you had any sense of the extent to which this shift and this sort of feelings of staff and the changes you saw are representative of WaterAid as a whole, or is this predominantly WaterAid UK?
My research was definitely predominantly WaterAid UK. So I was engaging with WaterAid UK. But that is something that I think would be interesting to look into. I mean, I've got some insights from country programs through having participated in various lunchtime talks or discover WaterAids or listen to recordings on the internet and whatnot. But no, I didn't interview that many country program staff. So that's a good question. But the strategy is a global strategy, so you would assume, and a lot of these structures like PMER, that cuts across our country programs as well. Quality program standards, they all cut across the federation, but my research was definitely focused in the UK.
Just to build on that, so when you say UK, our legitimacy comes from our country program. So is this ripple effect only in this building, or is this having an impact at the national level itself, especially from your consequential to your procedure? How far does that go in effect?
Yeah, so I think the next piece of research that could and should be done on something like this is, rather than looking at like what is seen as the headquarter and where policies, guidelines, standards are being formulated, but looking in country if it's actually being applied in practice in that way. That's a question that I'm not sure. We'd have to go to each country, like some country programs to see. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the word tensions right at the beginning, and I'm sort of wondering, especially looking at the last two bullets, what sort of tensions still remain and maybe even how they can be tackled, because people who like this sort of consequential view often have a different personality or a different motivation to the procedural one. I would even say that sometimes it feels as if we're working for different organizations. So how quick is the change in the strategy is to reflect in how tensions are resolved between people? How long does it take before the talent or the human resources change to reflect that change? And then also, I guess, I remember that when we changed to the new strategy and the shift away from the results, numbers, it took a really long time for country programs to let go of what they've been told for a very long time was the most important thing.
Yeah.
And stop counting user numbers where it didn't make sense at all. So, yeah, sorry. Long.
Yeah, I mean, it'll probably take some time. I think the interesting thing, for me anyways, was that this change is still very much underway at WaterAid. These are all happening now. So the tension chapter that I reported on, a lot of this came up in my interviews because that is the organization they were still seeing, and they weren't necessarily putting together all of the various strings of how change is currently moving in the direction they want to see anyways. So yeah, it's currently underway. And it probably will take time. It'll be interesting to come back in 5 years and see what people are saying about it.
There's a question online from Thea. which of these types of moral legitimacy is more connected to what the users, beneficiaries, or communities we work with think about an organisation's work?
Probably procedural. Procedural, consequential to an extent, but the consequential side only so much as if it's been done in conjunction with procedural moral legitimacy. So people in communities, they want a result, and a result that works well for them. And in order to get that result that works well for them, the procedural side is just as important as the output. Yeah. I'm just gonna, before we finish questions, I'm just gonna summarize real quickly. Okay, so overall conclusions of this is that, hey, the theory of moral legitimacy is a very useful framework for informing NGO strategic thinking and perception management. This is a framework we could start using and thinking about more, which makes me quite excited about opportunities to collaborate. Also, because this research was conducted on WaterAid, in the context of WaterAid, there's so many potential ways that we could leverage this work for institutional learning within our organization. And then from an external point of view, I think there's significant opportunity to use this piece of work to position WaterAid as a thought leader during a period of development sector transition. And we all know that there's a development sector transition going on here. I spoke to Marcus the other day, and he was saying that actually people are asking us, our peers are asking us, what is WaterAid doing right? How is WaterAid surviving this legitimacy crisis better than others? I would say it's because they've responded to these emerging demands on procedural moral legitimacy early, and they've created an enabling environment to make sure that it happens. So Marcus was quite excited about this piece. Maybe we could use this work research as the theoretical backing to kind of explain to our peers what's happening and what needs to happen for others as well.
Ask a question.
Yes.
You know,
hi, Rhiannon. How's it going?
you know, you said you've been asking Marcus about how WaterAid have been successful in this bit. What does success look like? What is success?
Well, see, I don't think anyone knows that, actually. So,
is it funding? Is it impact? Or what?
Well, if you look at how we've redefined success, it's obviously more than just it's more than just funding. It's the procedural side of things. And again, if we come back to what's happening in the wider climate of polarization right now, people are demanding this aspirational value, this moral, procedural side of things, because it's ultimately a battle of social norms. So if there's ever a time to take a stand from a position of values and beliefs, it's now, during a period of polarization. Yeah?
There was a question about the drivers behind the shift in moral legitimacy. So you've spoken about the external drivers that WaterAid is facing, the sector is facing currently. But you were also saying that WaterAid has sort of been ahead of the curve, and we have taken a procedural moral legitimacy years before others have recognised the importance of doing so. So were there internal drivers that fostered or created the demand for us to shift from whatever the other one was, not procedural, consequential to procedural? What were those drivers?
So I'd say internally, WaterAid has enjoyed significant growth over the last 10 years. And with growth, we've hired new talent, and we've brought in new people with skills and proficiencies in the procedural moral legitimacy space. And also, our understanding of development as development practitioners has evolved over time such that we prioritize procedural moral legitimacy in the work that we do. And WaterAid has somehow allowed for this beautiful organic evolution of internal influencing of staff members to allow this to bubble up. I think one of the biggest things I've heard in my interviews, and also based on my experience working at WaterAid, is a lot of what we do is internal influencing. A lot of our work is grounded on strong relationships. So by having, I guess, not having those bureaucratic kind of restrictions internally has allowed for this organic evolution towards procedural moral legitimacy driven by staff interests and proficiencies.
So in a sense, it speaks to the organizational culture.
Yes, yeah. So that, you're right, that links with this point too, and how this happened organically. Because if you, like the Insight team, for example, when that team, before that team was convened, it was somebody's side job to do market insight work. And then somebody came on board and had a full-time role in that space, and then we hired new people. And that audience segmentation work, that engagement framework work, was led by those individuals based on their interests and skills, rather than necessarily being told from directors what to do within your work portfolio or your objectives.
I think, but is it true to say as well that with WaterAid, particularly compared with other agencies, the kind of what people often talk about is the simplicity of the product, you know, water, clean water for people. It's so fundamental and kind of persuasive and attractive, and sort of, but also politically, perceived as politically neutral. So although you're talking about, so does that give us another opportunity, because the consequential legitimacy is kind of embedded in that mission of water and sanitation. So it's kind of like that's the bottom line. Whereas so although we might do more on the procedural legitimacy and so bring in issues of sort of governance and sector strengthening and so on, that's always bolstered up by the kind of that sense of the consequence.
Yeah, and this comes back to what Margaret was asking about, like which one should we be prioritizing. You need a balance of them all. Like they're all equally valid and legitimate in their own rights to focus on as an organization. You just don't want to prioritize one too much over another. So it's a delicate kind of balancing act between them all. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. No, I just wondered if that's part of like WaterAid's kind of advantage over some of the other agencies, though, because of that kind of that simple.
Yeah, it did come out in my interviews as well, asking people why they worked for WaterAid. The single issue focus was really attractive to people. Yeah.
Okay. I was just thinking now with your comment on how WaterAid externally has weathered the crisis, and well, I was thinking that this moral legitimacy is very it's very subjective. Mm-hmm. So it's about the perceptions of moral legitimacy. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you looked into that, because, for example, I was thinking maybe internally there is this clear shift towards procedural legitimacy, and people here in the UK office are perceiving that change. But to what extent is our communication outwards and the perception that the public has out there still on the consequential legitimacy and the people that will reach and taps and toilets? Because to me, in the UK context that is very Daily Mail driven legitimacy, it's actually the consequential legitimacy is safer than other more procedural one.
Yeah. Well, I'd say I think that's something that's interesting. That's maybe something that WaterAid should look at more, is take a look at what are external comms prioritizing based on this categorization of subtypes. But the strategy document and the newsletters that I analyzed definitely did prioritize procedural moral legitimacy throughout them, more so than consequential. And if you look back in history, it used to be like in these newsletters here, we used to have like all these pop-out boxes of reach number, target number, just number dump. None of that is really there anymore. It's still integrated in, but it's no longer as emphasized. So there is change in our external comms. And even if you look at the audience segmentation work and the engagement framework, the audience segmentation work is fascinating because we've prioritized targeting these new supporters who can also be advocates, and they demand procedural moral legitimacy. And if you want to create brand love, our engagement framework shows that somebody needs to understand who you are, what you stand for, and how you do things. So that understanding piece of WaterAid is also intimately linked to procedural moral legitimacy. So it is happening, but all of these changes are fairly new. Like the brand refresh is new, the engagement framework is new. These are all significant changes for WaterAid. So it will definitely take time for us to feel comfortable with implementing the shift in practice consistently.
Can I just comment on, because it's a really live, I mean, as we speak here, it's a very live conversation, because I think what we've realised just in the last month, when we were reporting to the board in July, was that we focused so much on that shift towards indirect and secular influence and so on, that we kind of lost sight on our direct user numbers or direct beneficiary numbers, and they've gone down significantly. So we were quite shocked when we saw those numbers. We realised that we put so much emphasis on this new direction that actually with the kind of nuts and bolts of those direct numbers are still important. And Tim was saying, we had a conversation with his chief executive, Thames Water. So some a supporter, an organisation that's followed us since our inception, they know our history, they know our records, knows our figures inside out and the strategic shifts we're trying to make. So he was drilling down with Tim saying, well, what about these type of users in Nigeria? What about this? So that, I think we've realised right now that actually that time lag we haven't managed very well. So, David Stedman, who's trying to write the annual report at the moment, is really grappling with how we're confident about that new narrative. And it's not that new, for us it's 2 or 3 years old now. Mm-hmm. But actually in terms of trying to make sense of that as a narrative for all types of supporters and WaterAid is a real challenge. So it's very hard.
And that comes back to that delicate balancing act piece. You don't want to have any one type of moral legitimacy dominate over others in practice, or you're not managing perceptions across your diverse stakeholders well.
It's very interesting because I think Tom Pellicadil and I sat inside the UNICEF Partners meeting recently in New York, and this is also a very live discussion for them. They have their main backbone donors in the room during that day, or during that week, and a few of them are really saying very openly, listen, the numbers matter for our governments. You have to give us the numbers. You've got to keep giving them to us. And then other governments, particularly actually the Scandinavian ones, interestingly enough, are the ones who are saying, yes, but we really need to ramp up the stuff that you're doing and telling the story and finding ways to measure the impacts you're having on systemic changes. And I think that, for me, is the story of WaterAid as well. We've taken this very bold shift and move, but our measurement framework and ability to tell the story has not necessarily kept up with the shift, interestingly. And I think for me, just going back to that question around the internal, some of the internal drivers, I think the other thing I think we need to recognize is this real core unrestricted funding base WaterAid UK's had for a long time. During that growth period, allowed us to invest actually not only in staff, but also in processes that allowed us to question and dig and research. And one of those was the sustainability post-implementation monitoring, which really showed to us that this constant investment in just putting in taps and toilets without dealing with the systemic changes that were necessary to sustain those ones was actually, the picture was quite shocking to some of us when we started to get those results. And all of that, for me, really became part of the discourse, all that volume of discourse that Robin was talking about, that was all produced, all these discussion papers and everything that went into this really deep consultative period leading up to the current strategy. So for me, I think that's a really powerful part of the WaterAid story is that level of thought that went, as painful as it was and as slow as it was for some of us, that level of thought process that went into that 2015 strategy was really actually very important.
I have a couple of questions online. How do you assess the success of the procedural moral legitimacy features that we have instituted? That's from Priya.
Yeah, so one thing I'm not doing is making judgments as to what is right or wrong in this thesis. I'm just trying to tell the story. So I'm not gonna, as a researcher, I'm not going to say what is successful implementation of procedural moral legitimacy or not. I'm just trying to tell the story of how WaterAid's gone about doing it. So I guess that'll come out in how WaterAid redefines those indicators of success.
And then one other question from Alan Gardiner. Comment rather than a question, actually. I think there's a big parallel with our engagement and fundraising work. The engagement framework and other projects are trying to move us more to PML and away from pure CML. But we need to do more to change internal mindsets, processes, and the ways of working.
That's a really great comment and leads me to something I wanted to throw out there, but didn't incorporate in my presentation. One of the things I did during this research was conduct some focus group sessions, some of you might have attended, where I presented moral dilemmas that had recurrently come up in interviews I had with staff and allowed a space for people to talk about them safely. And everyone, all the comments I got back on my surveys from that was that that type of forum for discussing moral dilemmas that present and understanding other people's point of view and how they go about navigating them was really, really helpful to facilitate this type of thinking about our development work. So that might be something we could do more of. Yeah. Dan, yes, you had a question.
I don't have a question. I have two more questions.
Oh, great. Love reflections.
So one was about, you were talking about the need for us to continue to be bold in terms of kind of positioning ourselves as a thought leader as our sector changes in terms of this procedural legitimacy. And I think, to me, that's really important because we talk about kind of having made a bold shift internally as an organisation towards this procedural legitimacy, and I think it would be a mistake to switch too far back, so to sort of be worried by our drop in user numbers to the extent that we switch back to, oh, we need to get our numbers right. And I absolutely agree that it's a really important strategic decision. I'm not belittling it at all, but to get that positioning right.
Yeah.
My other reflection was just, I would be really nervous about WaterAid being in any way smug or pleased with ourselves that we have retained some legitimacy during this crisis, because I'm sure, like many of us, I know lots of people who work at Oxfam who would feel that they had legitimacy until the moment that the media decided to come after them. And that could just as easily happen to us tomorrow.
Yeah.
So we might feel that we have legitimacy internally, but I think legitimacy is a very fickle concept. And we're not the only ones in charge of our own sense of legitimacy. So
no, you can try to manage it, but like there are strategies to manage legitimacy, but at the end of the day, it's a perception. So you're right, it's very, very fickle, and yeah.
Just to add to what you were saying on the shifting and like being careful to go back, I think, and that builds on Claire's point, the degree to which our working country is still based on the previous paradigm. And I mean, I have a very limited exposure, but I have had quite recently been quite shocked at the extent to which some of our work is still driven or constrained by user numbers. I think this will take a long time still. So yeah, I know we cannot just get rid of the user numbers, but I wouldn't say that we have gone too far away from it if we look at our on the ground work.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes. Okay, Louisa?
Just, I think, building on that, and I think the thing about in the countries that would be really interesting would be the perceptions of moral legitimacy by governments in particular, because we're situating ourselves as supporting governments. How do they see our moral legitimacy? Because they often want the numbers, they want the come and help us to reach our targets. So how do we communicate or use it in a way that would cement our sector's mission?
And I think that's about understanding what do different stakeholders prioritize, and then just shifting your narrative to align with that. Margaret?
We talked at the beginning about different types of legitimacy and the corporate sector having a different more pragmatic approach. For WaterAid, an NGO, how can you apply moral legitimacy principles or thinking to an ethical check, for example?
To an ethical check. Okay, well, I did a case study of corporate partnerships, and the ethical check came into that. What would I say for that? Okay, so with the ethical check, something I noticed was there was still quite a high degree of subjectivity around it. And I think that's kind of inherent to this type of thing, but we could have a little bit more information within it to guide people through applying the ethical check in practice. How do you actually apply this? What are we looking for? Those sorts of things. I can show you that chapter as well if you want to talk through it more specifically. So I guess it would be looking at things like that, and also the governance structures in that case. How are the decisions being made? I know that it's consultative in nature, and then it goes to IPD, it goes to PCD, it goes to comms and fundraising. But at the end of the day, not always, even though there's that consultative process, at the end of the day, the decision-making authority lies in the hands of the CEO and the board of trustees. So those sorts of questions as well. Yeah, and then, yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, so I did look specifically at that case study, and this is what came out of it as to why consequential moral legitimacy was dominating in those instances. And I think that we could do some work at WaterAid around our internal comms to get people to understand what the ethical check is more thoroughly and understand what WaterAid's position is. We now have a strong position that we partner with corporates. That's the position we take. But prior to our significant focus on partnerships, maybe that wasn't well understood within the organization internally, and we could have done more to manage internal perceptions. Yeah.
Would that then shift the positioning of moral and, procedural and consequential? Because if you work with corporates and certain types of corporates, as somebody, you had a quote in one of your slides, in the second or third one. Yeah, so that is the moral dilemma the staff have. You also noted that staff do not have 4 hours to discuss this. You did create a safe working space. So you have thrown out a few things. But having that approach, does that go back and question, or would our direction shift from your objective research point of view?
I don't think I fully understand the question.
So we are procedural right now.
Yeah.
But we are going to also have corporates of different kinds funding us. And so the means is also going to be questioned to the end.
Yeah.
And the end itself is also going to be questioned because the means don't always support the end.
Yeah.
So will we automatically shift?
I don't think so. I think it's about, when I started this research, what I wanted to see at the end of the day was NGOs having the ability to make decisions from the perspective of protecting their moral legitimacy and understanding it going into those discussions and negotiations with corporate partners. So as long as we understand the risks fully, and I think our history of engaging with corporate partners has kind of revealed that there's more risks than we maybe thought. Internal stakeholders are a significant stakeholder as well. So I don't think it necessarily has to do that. I think you just need to understand the nature of moral legitimacy and protect those procedural aspects and make sure that while you're implementing your project, that stays strong. Yeah. Because we need income to do what we do at the end of the day as well. And we need to collaborate with others in order to have the massive shift we want to see by 2030. So it has to be done, but how it's done, we can have control over that.
I think what was very interesting for me is that at the time of the research, that some of those moral dilemmas were extremely live. And so that's why it became the case study. But if I think now what happened consequently in terms of how we handled it as an organization, there was some thought process that went into this within particularly the corporate or strategic partnerships team, also around how decisions are made and which corporates to target as potential partners, as opposed to only looking at this stream of people coming at us. And so I think we have managed that. But yeah, could we do some strategic things around creating the space? Personally, as a person who writes a lot of comments in these ethical checks, for me, I think the thing is just clearer guidance of the ones we do go for and we don't go for would be helpful for me as a person providing an opinion on behalf of a directorate. Those sorts of things, I think, in that the ability in the space, as you say, to perhaps discuss some of those things would be really useful. I'm acutely aware we are beyond now our time. So, and no doubt people want to carry on talking, that's absolutely fine, but you can target this person right over here.
Yeah, I'll stick around for Thanks for coming.
Thank you,
I really appreciate it.
Good day going forward.
There's lots of knowledge in here, so feel free to put it in.